Self-compassion. I was first introduced to self-compassion through a therapy session with my personal therapist, where I did an exercise that she had prompted that truly changed the way that I viewed myself and how I react to others. And to walk you through what that exercise was, I received a piece of paper from my therapist and a pencil, and I was told to write a letter to a friend. I do this all the time. I love mailing letters and I think that it's really fun. But this was different because it was specific to a friend who's going through a hard time. And so she challenged me to think of a friend who needs support right now. And in doing so, I thought of a good friend of mine. I listed her by name on the note, and I wrote for about 5 to 10 minutes a note to her, to a friend who I love dearly and to a friend who needed support. And so I wrote things like, "You are loved, and I see you, and I hear you, and your story is important, and what you're doing right now is important." And I wrote down all of these things of how I typically speak to her, how I typically speak to my friends. And at the end of this exercise, my therapist had me reread the letter, but replace my best friend's name with my own name. And so I scratched off my friend's name at the top of the letter, and I read this letter to myself. And so I said, "Dear Emma, you are loved. You are heard, you are seen, what you're doing is important." And then my therapist invited me to take a look at what this means and to take a look at how I talk to other people versus how I talk to myself. Because the way that I spoke to my friend in that letter is not typically how I speak to myself. I'm not familiar with that language when it comes to speaking with myself. And that kind of translates into this idea of self-compassion. And that opens up this question of what is self-compassion. And so the definition of self-compassion is just practicing compassion the way that you do for others onto yourself to develop habitual self-kindness. And this was tokened by a Dr. Christine Neff, who has a lot more information in books and actually has another TED Talk on this, but specifically looking into self-kindness. This is important right now because we need to be patient with ourselves in this season. We have to allow ourselves that it's okay if we need extra time. We need to allow ourselves to truly understand that our worth is not measured in our productivity, especially during this season and this hardship. This global pandemic is the perfect opportunity to practice self-compassion because this is a chance where we need to be patient with ourselves and that we need to practice the love that we give to others onto ourselves. And so, the three important things that I'll touch on during this speech are the three main elements to self-compassion. And those elements defined by Christine Neff are self-compassion, self-kindness versus self-judgment, common humanity versus isolation, and finally, mindfulness versus over-identification. So I'll be touching on those three concepts in this speech, but I'll also be talking about what self-compassion isn't. By defining what self-compassion isn't, we'll be able to truly understand what it is and how we can manifest it in ourselves. And finally, I'll be offering you some tips for how you can practice it on your own. So, the first example that I have is self-kindness versus self-judgment. The way that I fully understand this was through Dr. Neff explaining in her research that it's like looking in the mirror. And so, if you have an experience where you look in the mirror and you're like, "Wow, I think that I've gained a little bit of weight," and your immediate reaction onto yourself would be completely different than if a friend had come to you and said, "Hey, I think I've gained a little bit of weight." A reaction to a friend might be, "What's going on? Is this something that you want to talk about? Is this serious? Do we need to make space for this conversation?" You can run through all of the examples of how you would speak to a friend in response to something like, "Hey, I think I've gained a little bit of weight." But in noticing it ourselves, it's oftentimes a judgment that comes automatically that we do not have the power or the clear mindset to be able to identify that it is negative self-talk. And so understanding that being warm and kind to others is a practice that you can do onto yourself. And in order to make that habitual, that is what defining self-kindness versus self-judgment is. The second part is common humanity versus isolation. Personal inadequacy is a shared human being trait. We all feel inadequate sometimes. No one was born into this world and signed a contract that they would be perfect all of the time. That's not a characteristic that any of us as human beings hold. And so it's important to understand that suffering is normal and it's a typical human trait that's experienced. And so this idea of common humanity versus isolation allows us to practice that it is common and that it's a natural human thing to experience suffering sometimes, and that we are not the only person in the entire world going through this. This gives us a tie to humanity and an opportunity to look at something outside of ourselves and to make a connection with others. The final tie to the three elements of self-compassion is mindfulness versus over-identification. Researcher Brene Brown sometimes describes this as dress rehearsing tragedy. Dress rehearsing tragedy is creating one situation and blowing it out of proportion in order for you to not be able to see that situation clearly. And so dress rehearsing tragedy might be you haven't gotten a text back from someone you love, and like a significant other, and your automatic reaction is that they're texting someone else, they've fallen in love with somebody else, that they don't want you anymore, when in reality there's no evidence to show that that's true. And so your mind is just over identifying what the situation might be. And mindfulness is just practicing what is absolutely true in that moment. It's asking ourselves what we believe, what we know is true. And so asking questions like, what will not change about this situation? What do I know to be absolutely true? And where am I dress rehearsing tragedy in that situation? And so seeing these things as they are will allow us to practice mindfulness, which will eventually allow us to practice self-compassion. Now it's important to discuss what self-compassion isn't. In defining this, we'll truly be able to understand how to practice self-compassion in ourselves. First, self-compassion is not self-pity. Becoming immersed in our own problems is egocentric, and that makes us think that we're all alone in these problems and that we're the only one suffering with these. And these typically can lead to just a depressive state where you think that you're completely all alone. This ties in with the isolation. Just having kindness with yourself to understand that you are tied to common humanity and that your suffering is not personal to you and that you're the only person suffering with that. It's a larger, and you can find someone who connects with you in that and build relationships. Next, self-compassion is not self-indulgence. Sometimes we think that being a couch potato or indulging in ice cream, tons of ice cream, or tons of negative food, unhealthy food, or maybe drugs is an opportunity to escape, and that's indulgence. And I'm not here to say whether indulgence is right or wrong, but what I am here to say is that indulgence is separate than self-compassion. That is something that Dr. Christine Neff defines, and self-compassion provides lasting happiness. So an example of that might be quitting smoking. An example of self-indulgence might be start doing drugs. So that's an escape that's temporary, when self-compassion focuses on something that is long-lasting. And finally, self-compassion is not self-esteem. I mentioned before that Dr. Christine Neff has a TED Talk about this concept that she created. She has a specific TED Talk about what self-esteem is. And so if you're curious about learning more about that, she talks about how self-esteem is self-worth. That is placing a worth on yourself that is predetermined or judged by other people. And that's not what self-compassion is. Self-compassion practices a view of yourself that is what's truest in that moment. It's not too high or too low. That's where self-esteem comes into play. Some tips for practicing this are available on the self-compassion website, that is selfcompassion.org. And some of those are guided meditations, which are basically a way to practice acceptance, and they're time-stamped and they're specific to your needs. And so if you consider yourself to be a caregiver, that website has a specific meditation that is 9 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes long, specific to a caregiver or specific to someone experiencing compassion fatigue. So those meditations are guided and provided by a professional, and I highly recommend them because they provide the words for you when you might not have them for yourself. Finally, exercises that are prompted with a question. Those are also available on the website, and these are a perfect method to practice self-compassion until it becomes habitual, because it prompts us to practice, to go back to journaling and back to supportive touch and kind of easing and meditating with our inner child, and how we can bring compassion to that. This relates to my the way that I opened up this speech with my letter to my best friend versus the letter to me. That's an example of an exercise that it can be practiced with self-compassion. In all, self-compassion is a radical new way of giving ourselves the same compassion that we give onto others. It's important to look at this and to look at this research because it will allow us to be the best versions of ourselves. And finally, this provides us with an opportunity to practice mindfulness in order to form habitual kindness onto ourselves in the same way that we practice kindness onto others. Thank you.